within Christianity, a lot of times you say, oh, it's just a local flood in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in the Middle East. Well, actually, there's powerful evidence. If we open our eyes, we've got to use our flood glasses to look at it. And you know something? You see it all over the place. Now, I've been in the creation evolution issue for about 30 years, and I've focused on earth sciences. You know, you can divide up the origins issue into the evolutionary assumptions, assumption A, and the creation assumptions, assumption B, and we use the same facts generally. I mean, there's some exceptions to this, the rocks and the fossils. And you know, with those different assumptions, we get totally different interpretations. It's where your worldview is. It's where your mind is. It's where your heart is that counts. Now, my focus has been on to use the assumptions, the biblical assumptions and science, and using the data, and to answer or try to answer challenges that the evolutionists has given us. That's been my challenge. Like, what about the ice age? What about rocks, fossils? How do they get there? See, that's been my focus, not necessarily to bash evolution, which is really easy to do. It really is. I was amazed how easy it is to do. And, of course, Mike and Tom have done a good job at doing that. So I'm going to look at the rocks and fossils. And actually, I'm not going to look at too many of them, but it's which bias we're talking about. Which interpretation? Either the Bible is true or the Bible is not true. Using mostly the same evidence. I must put a caveat on that because I go out in the field all the time looking at the rocks, and a lot of times it's what they don't report in the scientific literature in geology that's very key. So we go out and we see things out there that they don't report that is very key to the interpretation. First of all, it's a global flood. Now, I start with the Bible first and science second. And so when I grew up in what many would consider a liberal church, I wouldn't necessarily use that term, and I was taught, you know, there's errors in the Bible and the whole shot, so I had to check it out for myself. And I found that in the Bible, the evidence for a global flood wins hands down. The context, destroy all mankind. And by the way, why did God do this? Was it because he was mean and nasty? No, it says the evil was in man's thoughts continually. Man was thinking of evil continually. It must have been a horrible situation, so he had no choice. The ark landed in the mountains. Now, I'm a meteorologist. Actually, I'm the best type of meteorologist there are. That's a weather guesser for short. The best type is a retired weather guesser, and that's what I am. And I'm no longer to blame for ruining hundreds and thousands of picnics and all that outdoor activity. But anyway, when water dumps and you have a flood, anybody in a boat and like that is going to go downstream or end up in the ocean if you go far enough. They're not going to end up in the mountains. Well, the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. That's what happened if the waters were global and they just descended, dropped like that. And the first place the boat is going to land is on the highest terrain that shows up, and that's going to be the mountains. Makes a lot of sense. And why have all those animals on the ark if it's just a local flood? I mean, they could flee to the Zagros Mountains, which are pretty close to the Middle East, which are up to 15,000 feet high. And a 371-day flood is hardly local. I've forecasted a number of floods, flash floods, river floods, and they're over with in usually a day or even sometimes an hour. 371-day flood is hardly local. So the Scripture indicates that it was a global flood. And the covenant of the rainbow would make no sense if it was a local flood, because there's been hundreds of thousands of local floods since. Like Genesis 7:9, as far as context, says, and the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Now, doesn't that sound like a universal global flood? And just think of this. Look at the upper left in there. Look at that beautiful rainbow. It's a promise from God that he'll never again flood the entire earth as he did in Noah's day. Well, my Christian college professor said that Noah's flood didn't cover the entire earth. He told you it was just a localized flood? That's what he said. Look at the bottom right. So he believes that God promised to never again send a localized flood? See, it doesn't make sense, does it, that it's a local flood? And, of course, Jesus. Now, that's where the buck should stop. Jesus says, for in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. Jesus believed that Noah was a real person, the ark was a real person. I mean, the ark was a real boat. Hey, I'm a morning person. And I fade in the evening, so if I trip over my words, forgive me, please. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. Just a few of them? In the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, in the local flood? No, all of them. Anyway, now if you're thinking of a flood, I'm using a man named Tasman Walker from Australia. He developed a terminology or a model of a flood just from Scripture. What would you expect from the flood? Well, it would rise and it would fall. I mean, that's what floods do, right? And, of course, we don't know what the pre-flood geography was like. In fact, it was probably totally ripped up and destroyed. But, in general, the relative sea level is like this, and the time in the flood is this way. By the way, the flood was 371 days, not 40 days. But if you had to draw the sequence of the flood, it would be a rise with sea level going up and down in a general rise. That's what that squiggly line means. It's not because I can't draw, which is actually a true statement, but it's because I deliberately did that, because sea level, because of tectonics and other forces, would be going up and down like this in a general rise. Then it'll peak about 150 days. Now, there's some people that think that it peaked at 40 days. It's, you know, a difference of opinion, and there's no way to resolve it. But at 150 days, it starts to flow off the earth, and the present continents become exposed. That's what we expect in a flood. Now, you can split that up into the flooding stage for the first 150 days and the retreating stage. Now, I'm only going to focus in on the retreating stage because that was the last stage of the flood as it came off the land. So we should see the evidence of the retreating waters off the land if the flood was a real event. This gets into the geological field of what's called geomorphology. Remember that big word that Mike gave you called morphology? Shape means shape. Geo means earth. It's the shape of the earth. And the shape of the earth, features of the earth's surface, should say flood. And the alternative explanation, uniformitarianism, which is the present is the key to the past, should have a lot of difficulty explaining these things. So that's what I'm going to focus in on. And you can divide that up into two phases. The water moving off the land as a sheet and then moving off in channels. Now, why channels and the sheet? Because when the earth is totally flooded and you only have maybe one mountain up, Mount Ararat, you know, the water's moving around the earth maybe in currents 1,000 miles wide. So it's moving sort of as a sheet. Not very deep, maybe it's 1,000 feet deep, but it's 1,000 miles wide. It's moving across the earth like that. And it produces certain features on the earth's surface. But then when you got mountains and plateaus sticking up, you know, the water's forced to flow around these obstacles. And therefore it forms channel. It's the channelized phase. So there's two phases. Water moves as a sheet, then it's forced to become more channelized. And it's important to point this out because features on the Earth's surface give evidence of both phases. So I'm going to talk about, especially about water moving as sheets. Most of my talk is going to be about the evidence of the water moving off the continents as sheets. It causes rapid erosion of the continents. See, the continents are rising, the water's moving off. It's going to erode those continents. And then where's the material going to go? It's going to end up along the edge of the continents in deeper water. And what is it going to do? It's going to plane land, forming what's called planation surfaces. And I'm going to go through all this. This is a summary of my talk right here. But this is, I'm going to also talk about this. As it's moving in channels, it's going to cut what is called water and wind gaps. A typical water gap around here is the Columbia Gorge. It's a cut in the mountains that's perpendicular to it. That's a water gap, to where water is flowing through it. I don't think I'm going to get into wind gaps. That's a gap higher in the mountains where you have a V notch out and only wind is going through that. I don't think I'll have time, but I have pictures for all these. Also, it forms what's called pediments. A pediment means near, and ment means mountain. So it's a flat planation surface at the foot of a mountain. And it excavates submarine canyons, all very rapidly. Submarine canyons are canyons that you go out on the continental shelf, and perpendicular to the continent, you have this deep gash that goes about an average of 3,000 feet deep and 50 miles long is the average submarine canyon. Now, there are hundreds of submarine canyons along the continents. And some of these canyons are deeper than Grand Canyon. And one of them is even longer than Grand Canyon. It's the Bering Canyon. Now, if you did a present-day erosion of the surface for 5,000 years in various reliefs, mountains to smooth plains and high precipitation, this is the rate currently. 7 feet in 5,000 years, and the lowest is down in here, less than a foot. This, of course, there have been ice ages, which I'll talk about tomorrow about ice ages. If you think this air conditioning is cold in here, wait till I talk to you about the ice age tomorrow. Hope to freeze you out. But anyway, the point of this is that the flood was about 5,000 years ago. So this is not a lot of erosion. So what the flood produced should still be there. It didn't have time to erode in 5,000 years because we've had very little erosion in 5,000 years. That's the point of that. So the first question to ask when you have a totally globally flooded Earth, how did the waters drain? Where did they go? Well, I think Psalm 104, 6-9 has the answer. It's really interesting how in some cases it's right there, right in the Bible. Psalm 104 says, "The waters were standing above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. The mountains rose, the valley sank down." That's the key verse right there. The mountains rose, the valley sank down to the place which thou didst establish for them. Thou didst set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. There are 2 times in the history of the earth that the earth was totally flooded. On the 3rd day of creation, when it was created with covering of water, and in the global flood. This obviously is talking about the global flood because this is the last time that the earth was totally flooded. But at thy rebuke the waters fled, and at that time the mountains rose, the valleys sank down. That's how they drain. In other words, mountains rise, valleys sink down, and then at the same time continents rise and ocean basins sink. So the waters flow off the continents into the ocean basins. Like this. This is the Continental Divide here in western Montana. And it's uplifting. It's probably the first area to get up, to come out of the floodwaters. And the water is flowing strongly towards the Pacific Ocean on the west side and strongly towards the Mississippi River Valley on the east. That's the picture I want to present. Now, it's interesting that you can go to many mountainous areas or many places on the earth, in fact, practically all places of the earth, and it's a theme that you have sections of the crust that have gone up and sections that have gone down. Now, where I live, in southwest Montana, I'm close to what's called the Beartooth Mountains right here. Now, they're about 10,000 to 13,000 feet tall, and that's granite. That pattern is granite. But you go to the adjacent Bighorn Basin, and it's filled with sediments. But granite, where you reach granite in there, is at 10,000 feet below sea level. So at this point right in here, what's called the Beartooth Fault, you had a differential change where the mountains went up and this valley or basin went down, and a 23,000-foot difference right here at the Beartooth Mountains. Over on the other side of the Bighorn Mountains, you have another situation with the Bighorn Mountains and the Powder River Basin. In fact, most little mountain ranges east of the Continental Divide are like this, where you have mountains rise and valleys sink down. This is a theme, a global theme, just like Psalm 104 says. And I think it was also a theme on a larger scale, where the continents were coming up out of the floodwaters and the